Hello, everybody, and welcome to Waterford Writers Weekend. My name is Libby, and I'm interviewing the prolific Deirdre Sullivan on her new YA novel, Precious Catastrophe. So welcome, Deirdre. Deirdre,
Thank
sorry.
you for having me.
No worries at all. So I guess I'll start off with the interview with the all-important question of what is your favorite book?
It's hard to know. There are so many books in the world, Libby. I have a fondness for Angela Carter, her fairy tale retelling collection, The Bloody Chamber. There is a collection of short fiction by Emma Donoghue called The Woman Who Gave Birth to Rabbits that I really, really love. And there is another collection of short fiction by a woman called Amy Bender, The Girl in the Flammable Skirt, and that's fantastic as well. I like magic realism. I like horror. I like a bit of everything. And my favorite book is kind of mutable. Like it changes with my mood.
Yeah.
Because there are just so many good stories in the world.
Yeah. And so you were saying that you liked magical realism and stuff, and that's definitely comes through in your latest novel. And I was just wondering, what kind of inspiration do you take when you're writing books? Is it from like real world examples? Like, do you have to sit in cafes to like overhear people speak, or is it mainly from like books that you've read, or is it movies or actual real people that you've met?
In terms of inspiration, you kind of with the overheard in cafes, you always think of Maeve Binchy, and her advice to like be listening to people everywhere. And I mean, there's certainly a seed of myself in everything that I write. But I begin with my YA fiction with character. So kind of with Perfectly Preventable Deaths, the first book in the series, it was Maddie's character who was very, very strong for me. And in terms of what inspired her, I think it's a little bit of everything. Like you're saying, the stories we consume inform the stories that we make. They can't not. I believe that every writer should be a reader. But at the same time, you kind of fuse it with your own imagination and your own experience, and you kind of take them for a walk. I found it very easy to get immersed in Maddie right away, and at times I found it was almost like getting to know a person, like she would surprise me. With Precious Catastrophe, there's a dual narrative. So Maddie is still one of the narrators, but we kind of meet her sister Caitlin as well in the aftermath of the events of the first book. And it was a challenge for me to, I suppose, differentiate the two voices, because there's a lot that they share, kind of they're twins, they're sisters, although their personalities are quite different. But with, I found the dual narrative was something I was worried about, but I think kind of once I got to know Caitlin better, it came more easily than I had been expecting.
Yeah. And so the theme of sisterhood is like very prevalent in Precious Catastrophe. So do you have a sister, or where did you kind of draw inspiration? Because they're clearly very close, but there's one amazing scene where they're just about to like go in and like kill Caitlin's ex-boyfriend, but then they have this like massive argument, and like it's so realistic the way like sisters interact. Like there's a lot of like low blows in there and stuff. And I was just wondering, like, where did you take inspiration for such a realistic relationship?
Well, I don't have a sister. I have a brother, and I'm very close to him. But I feel like kind of even if you don't have a sister, like growing up, you kind of collect sisters.
Yeah.
Like the world. Well, maybe I've been very fortunate. Like the world has given me women that I have been very, very close to since childhood, since I was like 3 or 4. So, kind of. And you have like those knockout, drag down fights, not so much as adults, but thank goodness. But, kind of I would have drawn a lot on the affection and love that I haven't had for them, and on the dynamic that we had together.
Yeah. And so the other theme that's very strong in your novel is the theme of witchcraft. So kind of, did you have to do like real world research for that? Because a lot of it seems like very realistic in a way, or did you just completely make up that kind of world in your head?
A little bit of both. I wanted the magic in Perfectly Preventable Deaths to be intuitive because, kind of you need a talent for witchcraft to execute it correctly in this world. It's not a recipe. Kind of if lavender always relaxed you, then anyone could really do it.
Yeah.
So the witch herself is part of the equation, an ingredient in a way. So I would have done, for Precious Catastrophe, I did 2 courses in herbalism, short courses, 1 course in reading the tarot. I read an awful lot around witchcraft, around ritual, because while I knew I wanted my witchcraft in Perfectly Preventable Deaths not to be based on any one system. So kind of say if I'd gone for Wicca or if I'd gone for kitchen witchcraft, there would have been like a prescription there, a map. And I wanted it to be something very, very personal, that came from who Maddie was, who Catelyn was, and, kind of who Mamo is, like in terms of like the other witch in the books. So yes, I did an awful lot of research, but then I threw a lot of it away and kind of made up my own stuff and had fun.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And then, so in your books as well, like magic is like kind of very closely related to a more structured form of like the Catholic Church, and like we see dialogue between Mamo and the local priest, who like seems like a really nice guy, like kind of one of the heroes of the story. So like, what was your inspiration there? Because I feel like the Catholic Church in Ireland doesn't get a lot of attention when it comes to YA novels, especially. So kind of what made you put the Catholic Church at the forefront of it?
Well, I feel like the Catholic Church has cast a long shadow over our society, for good and ill. And there is, like with Irish Catholicism, there is a seam of paganism that runs through it. And I don't have faith at the moment, but there are certain rituals that I learned as a child that I will cling to, kind of, for example, if I see a fire engine or an ambulance, I will often find myself crossing myself because it's like a little spell for whoever that vehicle is going to, that they will be safe. If someone I love is sick or in hospital or has passed away, I will light a candle and I will think of them. And those are things that I have been given by the Catholic Church, but are not necessarily Catholic. And in terms of prayer magic for Catelyn and that love of ritual, if you're looking at ritual and incense and kind of worship and devotion and all of that, like, I mean, it made sense for it to be drawn to the Catholic Church. I also, I didn't want to shy away from Ireland's history. So it is referenced in the novel, kind of the Magdalen laundries, the adoption and all of that, because I feel like there are a lot of people who do have faith and who find all that stuff really difficult to reconcile, because there is a nourishment that spirituality gives us. And I think we do have a big need, like, and that's one of the purposes of witchcraft, isn't it? To kind of build yourself a spirituality in the absence of one that speaks to you, and I wanted Catelyn to have that because it's a coping mechanism for so many people.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And then, so on that note then of kind of exploring darker themes within the novels, there's also, it's punctuated by like a lot of comedy, which I really liked. Like I found myself laughing out loud at a lot of parts in the novel. And so how important is kind of a comedic element for you within your novels? And is it difficult to kind of come up with jokes and stuff?
Not really. Like, I begin with character, and I feel like a lot of us, like, maybe it's an Irish thing, maybe it's a human thing. When we are going through something traumatic, like, it's not divorced from humor. And it's a coping mechanism for so many of us to take a step back and look at the ridiculousness of the situation and find some levity even in the darkest of times. And I would feel, it's a coping mechanism I use myself. And I would find it unnatural for the girls not to, not to have those interactions and not to make light of the situation or not to like play with ideas and images. And I think, kind of it is important to me as well, like that while all that is going on, that they are still going through some really, really, really intense things. And I never wanted to make fun of that.
Yeah.
I wanted to show, I suppose, yeah, it's about coping and it's about healing and it's about finding light in the dark and finding the strength to laugh when you want to cry. As opposed to, I suppose, making fun of the very, like, I know it's kind of all witchcraft based and like it's not a book that is set in a realistic world, but it is real to them. And they have been through some very, very traumatic events. And I wanted to, I suppose, meet that with compassion and with the weight that it deserved at the same time.
Yeah. And even though like the actual specific events that happened to them, which I like don't want to spoil too much, but I suppose in your first book, Catelyn's ex-boyfriend now like tries to eat her and then she dies. And that stuff isn't so realistic to what teenagers go through, but like that kind of being betrayed, like by falling in love for the first time and then being betrayed by that person, or the grief of losing a parent and then having to watch another parent move on, as the girls have to do. I suppose those are quite universal things. And
Yes.
Did you find it helped you write within a magical world to be able to kind of portray those very real events more universally?
Yes. And like I wanted to look at the dynamic of an older person preying on a younger person in the first book. And while I used the character of Lon to do that, I was aware that while maybe there's not face eating involved, like, there are a lot of people who go through that, who go through grooming, who go through feeling that they are so in love with someone who is obviously exploiting them. And, kind of, there's been a lot of talk about like coercive control and relationship abuse at the moment. Like there was a book I wrote a few years ago called Needlework, and I kind of would have done some research into domestic violence, relationship abuse, and kind of chatted a bit to Women's Aid about it. And it's 1 in 4, like 1 in 4 women in relationships will experience partner abuse in some form. So it's something that is very real, and it was important to me that even though I was using horror to tell Catelyn's story, that the human way in which they react to it, kind of feel true to the reader. And I hope I achieved that.
No, yeah, you definitely did. And I also found one of the themes in Precious Catastrophe was kind of, there was 2 parallel storylines of kind of the older generation of the mothers, say, in the novel, of Una's mother and the girls' mother, kind of Sheila, who both have husbands that necessarily aren't very good people. And it's very well explained that it's not just it's not so easy as to just leave.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting.
No, thank you. Because it is that thing, and like it isn't easy for anyone at any stage of life, and it can also happen to anyone at any stage of life. It just depends on meeting someone who will draw you in and hurt you, and that is such a human thing, and it's a thing so many of us can experience, and there's no antidote to it or no vaccine you can take to ward it off. Kind of sometimes you hear the rhetoric of like, oh, I would never let anyone do that to me, I would never walk. But it's not that simple. Someone like these people are broken down, and by the time it gets to, well, like in this book, the face eating, like there's no way Catelyn could have walked away from Lon. She literally would not know how.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so because your novels deal, with such big topics, of the whole writing process in general, what part do you find the most difficult?
I find structural edits really, really hard.
Yeah.
The first book in the series, Perfectly Preventable Deaths, was written over a period of 7 years. And Libby, I did 18 drafts.
Fair play.
It was a lot.
I wouldn't have stuck with something for that long.
But you would though. But like my heart wanted to tell the story, so it was worth the work. But when you get feedback like, can you move this scene to act 1 instead of act 3? Like that's the stuff I find really, really hard, because you tell it from start to finish, and the scenes aren't Lego blocks. It's like a whole, it's a movement.
Yeah.
So however my brain works, I find it really hard to break it down into little bits and move things back. I am getting better at it. Like 18 edits will do that to you. But like if there's a particular part of the process that I find extra difficult, it's that one. It's when you're shifting things around, rather than like the fun bit is like when you get to live inside a character, right? I don't mind rewriting scenes. I don't mind stepping into someone's, kind of sounds really creepy like a serial killer, Libby, but like stepping into someone's skin, that kind of way. Like that's what I live for in writing. Like it's so exciting. And like, kind of you can, even a scene you've written a few times, you can like come up with a new image or a new perspective on it. That's really, really satisfying. But when you're just doing the nuts and bolts of like, okay, Brian has to say that in act 1 so that in act 3 this can pay off here. Like that's just really like, it's not exactly how my brain works, and I find it a challenge.
Yeah, and so how do you like, because I know like for me, if I'm not enjoying writing, like I literally just won't do it. Like the other day I like cleaned the sink of my bathroom, which I don't think I have ever cleaned the sink of my bathroom my entire life, because I just was like, I'm just not feeling this at the minute. So how do you kind of make yourself, I suppose, because no one is going to force you down, gun to your head and make you write unless you're Stephen King in Misery. But like, how do you motivate yourself?
Okay, so I have a few tricks, but first I will say to you a wise thing, and it is not my wise thing. It belongs to a friend of mine called Camille De Angelis, who is a writer, an American writer. She writes kind of speculative fiction, and she has a wonderful blog post about how you're not always aware that you're writing. Mm-hmm. So if you're blocked on a project, Libby, and you go to clean the sink, you could actually be writing, because the cogs in your brain are turning, and sometimes they just need to, like, sometimes your subconscious just needs to work stuff out so that like there's space for the idea to pop into your head. I do an awful lot of house cleaning as well when I'm trying to write and can't, or I would go for a walk. But one of my kind of tips, I suppose, like, I mean, none of us really know what we're doing. Like, you know what I mean? It's also instinctive. But I would say building a sustainable writing practice, kind of finding a way to incorporate it into your day or into your week, depending on the chunks of time you have. So I would sit down at my desk most days and do maybe half an hour. That's what I can fit in with my life. Like, there are days when I can write full time, and I'm very, very privileged in that. When I was working full time as a teacher, if, for example, I had an edit to do, I would set myself 25 pages a night and work through it that way. I think like breaking things down into small, manageable chunks, whether it's even like I will write for 5 minutes every day, I will write 3 sentences when I get up in the morning, or 3 sentences before I go to sleep at night. Like, that kind of makes it doable. And once you're used to writing, it becomes easier and it flows better. The other thing is that if you're blocked on one project, to have another little project on the go. I have a collection of short fiction that came out at the beginning of the summer called I Want to Know That I Will Be Okay. And a lot of those stories were written at points in other projects where I couldn't see where they were going. So I would leave them in a drawer for a week or two and just work on a project that reminded me why I love it. Because I do love it. Like, I think everyone who writes like has to, you know, even if you're tearing your hair out or really, really stressed about getting something right, like, you're drawn to it because you love it, because it nourishes you in some way, you know, and that's kind of what makes people come back, because it's certainly not, you know, it's not a like sensible job, is it?
Don't say that to me. So, you were talking about like structural edits and how you have a friend that's a writer. So, kind of, at what point do you show your friends or your family like what you've been writing? Do you wait until it's like fully off to get published, all finished, or will you show them an earlier draft?
This is really interesting because it's changed. And I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and it's changed for her as well. So I used to show things to people an awful lot earlier. I think particularly like when I finished my first book, I had finished a book. It was the most words. No one had ever written as many words as I had written. Do you know what I mean? I was so proud of myself. Like I didn't think that I could do it, and I'd done it. And sure, listen, I had to read over it and send it all and sundry. Do you know, you're kind of like, because you've never done it before, so you don't know what you don't know what the editing process is, and I think that you kind of need that as a young writer and as an emerging writer, like for a group of other writers at the same stage as you who like the kind of stuff you're writing, like friendly eyes for your work. They're a gift. But now I wouldn't show someone something unfinished, and it's normally at about draft 3 by the time I would happily share it. Now that kind of depends on deadlines, because like once kind of, if you're under contract for a book, you may have to share it a little earlier than you're comfortable with, just to kind of prove that you're working away in it. Give me another month. Look at this. But no, it's kind of changed, and I am, I suppose, more protective of my work now until I know what it is. Or until it's like you kind of have a shape or like a kind of form in your head of what you want it to be. And until it's as close to that as I can make it, I'm more hesitant to share it with other people. Though I do, when I edit, I read aloud. And with Precious Catastrophe, obviously it was written during the pandemic, and I would read what I had written to my husband at the end of every day. But like, like this is going to sound real bad, but like I don't really count him as, like it's almost like reading to myself, because he's not going to judge me. He's not going to come in with like the, kind of like stern feedback or anything. It was just a very, it was a very exciting thing to be like, well, look, they did this, and we'd kind of chat about it, and he looked forward to it and I looked forward to it. I probably looked more forward to it than he did. Sit down now till I read you my chapter.
That's okay. My mom was writing her PhD in lockdown, so that's what she would read to us.
Wow. What was her PhD on?
It's a good novel.
What was it on?
It's sociology. So not nearly as exciting as face-eating ex-boyfriends.
Yeah, but it's so important.
He's not watching this. So my question, yes, is have you ever received any, because I know that there'll probably be a lot of teenagers writing this, and I know I had 1 or 2 experiences where I kind of got like soul-crushing feedback. And did you ever kind of get feedback that was particularly harsh that kind of almost made you want to give up writing, or do you find that it was ultimately like a positive thing and it made you a better writer?
Both. So there are different approaches with writing facilitators. And at one point before I had published, I encountered a facilitator, and I actually think that this person was trying to support me in a way that would have worked for them. But it was very tough love. It was very kind of, I would write something very intimate and maybe email and say, I'm not comfortable reading this in front of people. And this person would open the next class with, now Deirdre must read her work in front of all of you. And that broke my trust in them. And I don't necessarily know if it set me back a little, but it did make me more reluctant to share my work. But however, that's like one experience. There have been, and also that approach could have worked wonderfully for someone else who just needed to be brought out of themselves. Do you know, I am quite happy in my little turtle shell. Like, thank you very much. Do you know, like I'm an introvert and I do connect, like I connect very deeply to what I write. And like even more so, I think at the beginning of, you know, like when you're starting out, like everything you write, it's so like everything you write comes from the meat of you anyway, do you know? But when you haven't shown something so important to you, to anyone, and then to have to just to be forced to kind of share it.
Yeah.
You know, it was just out loud. It was just I did not like that, and I found that unhelpful. However, I've gotten feedback, like I've gotten a lot of rejection as a writer. You know, I've had successes and I'm so happy and I'm so aware of my good fortune in the editors and the publishers that I have worked with. But, you know, kind of when you're looking for an agent, you send it, you know, you don't send to just one agent, you send to like kind of maybe 10 people, like over the, like not like on in the one day with like a copy pasted letter, like you tailor it, you know, but and you get rejection. Or if you're sending short fiction to a literary journal, like even now, like not everywhere I send stuff will accept the stuff, you know, and that doesn't change as you grow as a writer. Like you're always getting, you know, like waiting to find the correct home for a thing, for a variety of reasons. And I think you get more used to it, because as more and more people have read your work, it's not that it matters less, and it's not that it's any less a form of self-expression, but you get used to people not enjoying it or responding to it in a way that you wouldn't have imagined. Like, you know, kind of you look at Goodreads and it changes you.
Don't do that. Don't ever do that. I've actually have this, I was at a pub quiz there the other night, and one of the best ones was like 1-star Goodreads reviews, and it was like some of my favorite books, and people were just like tearing the shred. There was one like 1-star review of Ulysses, and it was like, this book isn't intelligent enough or something, and it's like, you clearly don't know what you're talking about. So people can be cruel. So how did you deal with kind of that rejection? Did you ever, like, did you always, like, were you born and you were like, I'm going to be a writer, and then you like stuck with that the whole way? Or did you come into it and lose hope? Or kind of what was your journey with that?
I think I call myself a writer, and I didn't always, Libby, and I don't call myself an author. And that's very deliberate, because I feel like being a writer is something you get to decide for yourself. But being an author is more, and it's just my own little definition in my head that helps me. But like being an author is dependent on publishers, on gatekeepers, on those people who can reject you. But like, as long as you've got a pen and paper, you can be a writer. Do you know? I remember actually the first time I was introduced as a writer. I remember the first time I called myself a writer, it was on a train to Belfast to my first literary event. And I was like, well, I'm getting paid to talk about the book that's in my suitcase. So, you know, I am a writer. But it was difficult. And I think kind of it's a big thing. I would always have written. I would have always written like poetry, little stories. I would have journaled a lot, like from when I was very, very young. But I didn't show them to people. And I thought that wanting to be a writer was a little bit like wanting to be a wizard. Do you know, that you kind of had an idea what it would look like? You know, you'd have a wand, you'd have a pointy hat, you'd be able to do spells, but like you had no, you know, like kind of wizards don't have mortgages, you know, like I didn't know how you got from, you know, being a kid in your room with a notebook with sunflowers on it, writing poetry in purple ink about boys that broke your heart, to, you know, kind of being an author, you know, and I didn't know any writers. I didn't, you know, I knew books came from people, but I didn't really have any idea of what those people were like, you know? And I kind of wouldn't have shared my work with people until I was in final year of college, because I had this sense that it was now or never. That I'd either go off and do something else and kind of probably always write but never share it, or I could go and just give it a go. And I remember the first time I read like aloud, I read a poem called Lucy Wakes, and my hands were going like this, and it was so hard because it's intimate and it's self-expression. You're expressing yourself. Like when you read something you've written, you're saying, hear me. And I think particularly as women, like we're silenced so much, and to value the weight of your voice at all is like quite a step sometimes. But I was very fortunate in that I did a creative writing course when I went back to do teaching. It was a module on the course called Teacher's Writer of Fiction. And when I was doing that course, the facilitator, Siobhan Parkinson, really liked what I wrote. And at the end of it, she took me aside and asked me to write a book for her publishing imprint.
Yeah.
And I think I would have come to being a published writer anyway, and I certainly would have written because it's always been part of who I am. But without that little kernel, like giant bar of belief in me and faith in me, I don't think I would have been published as early as I was. And I think it would have taken me longer to realize that I could do it. And like, there are women that we meet in our lives that are there for a reason and that guide us and that help us. And like, I only hope that I pay it forward, because I wouldn't be here talking to you today if it wasn't for Siobhan. She's amazing,
Yeah. So would you recommend then for young writers to always like take the leap of faith and take every opportunity? Or, because I know that sometimes there's a lot of talk though about, kind of oversharing and maybe like giving too much of yourself. And I know that myself anyway, I used to write a lot of poems and stuff. I still do write a lot of poems and stuff. I don't know why I act like I'm like 50 years old. And I always, and I never know, like at what point is it like a good poem and at what point is it just like me writing poems about someone who broke my heart and that no one really wants to hear.
People absolutely want to hear poems. I want to hear these poems. But I think like you'll know, and as you write more and more poems and share more and more, you'll know when you're giving too much of yourself. And the kind of sad thing is, and it's like all too often with like female writers, you will be asked to give bits of yourself. If you're promoting a book that deals with a certain subject, you'll be asked if you've been through those things. Like I have been, like with needlework, it's about childhood sexual abuse. Like I have point blank been asked if that happened to me.
Wow, that's so inappropriate.
Yes. Yes, it is. And like I think they do it more to women than men. So kind of I'd love to say kind of follow your heart, give everything, and all of that. But like, yes, like you have to, but you will learn to protect yourself, and you will learn what parts of you are like you are happy to share and make art about and kind of explore. It's one of those things where you kind of learn by making mistakes, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like that's not real cheery advice, but like it's all I have.
Yeah. No, I know, because there's a lot at the minute. I think there's kind of been this whole kind of surge of like this really like personal writing and this like, personal essays and everything. And I personally, like, I love reading them. Like, I think they're amazing. And especially as you said, ones about women, I find them really interesting and really good, because for so long there wasn't these kind of like intensely personal stories about, things like abortion or domestic abuse or anything at all, and even from men as well, like all sorts. But at the same time, if that is what is popular now, you know, I can sense that maybe there is a lot of young people, young writers who are so desperate to be noticed that they're willing, as you said, to give kind of bits of themselves away in order to kind of go up the ladder and stuff and become more noticed. So how would you deal with that? Like, you know, I'm wondering.
Yeah,
I don't think anyone knows.
No, I don't think they do. But I think coming back to your motivation, I wrote an essay at one stage about my mother and about me and about bodies. And I have apologized to my mother since then for writing that essay, because it was, I feel like I gave too much of her, and she's not mine. She don't belong to me. She's my mother, but she doesn't belong to me. And it didn't sit right with me. But one of the reasons that it didn't sit right with me is because writing that essay coincided with having a book put into the world. And I had been asked to write articles to promote the book. So it didn't come, like, I wanted to make it as good as possible. I wanted the imagery to be beautiful. I wanted it to be a nice, coherent thing that did justice to the subject. But my motivation for writing it at that particular time, in that particular forum, was the fact that I had a book out and I wanted people to read the book.
Yeah.
So that's a lesson.
Yeah.
And I think
way of dealing with it.
Yeah, and I think coming back to I'm being very honest here. But you know, coming back to your motivation, you know, and looking at, why did I write that? Why, you know, and if it's, I wanted to take an idea for a walk, I wanted to explore something that had happened to me. I wanted to make art. You know, you can just want to make art. You know, those are all fine motivations, but if it's for motivations that won't sit with you well later on, I think that's the time to maybe take a step back, you know?
Yeah, no, that's good advice. I have just kind of a couple of more questions. One that I've been thinking about a lot is, you were saying you wrote Precious Catastrophe throughout the pandemic. And I'm just wondering, like, say if you, because your books, I know that, you know, that Perfectly Preventable Deaths series is obviously set in a slightly altered reality, but it is magical realism. Like, it's still a very recognizable world. Certainly for me, there was so much of the town that I grew up in, like within the novel, like the local priest and, you know, everyone knowing each other and stuff. And the amount of tea that is drunk in the novel as well. They're always drinking tea. But like, at what point do you think you'll ever put COVID into your stories? Like, will you have people like, oh shit, I forgot my face mask, let me run and back and get it? Or is it kind of, are you going to try and keep it out of your novels in the future, or do you know?
I don't know. And I think kind of, I couldn't have put it in Precious Catastrophe because it was too immediate.
Yeah.
But I absolutely think that there is art to be made about COVID, and that there are good stories and good images, and, you know, kind of, there are probably people writing wonderful books that deal with the pandemic right now. I just don't know, like, because I think we're all, even though it has been years, we're all still making sense of the shape the world is taking and how it influences people. And even like on a very practical level, I know what it's like to be a teenager in secondary school, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like to have to wear a mask all day. You know, so there are like elements of young adulthood right now that would require, like, I suppose, more research and more listening. So I don't necessarily feel qualified to write a young adult book set during COVID just yet.
Yeah. I don't think anybody does. It still feels, because even like when I watch movies and stuff now and I see like a crowded airport and like no one wearing a mask, or like I see like a shopping center full of people or a restaurant full of people, I'm like, that's so weird, because that's not the world anymore. Like, it's so strange that that might never happen again, where you'll see like a crowded airport with no one wearing a face mask. It's so strange that our reality has completely shifted.
Yeah, it's very, like, it is very strange. And like, to kind of, like, the time before, at like like, I don't know if face masks are going to be ubiquitous now, or, you know, if the vaccine will take, if COVID will be eradicated. But like, those things may belong to historical fiction now. And that's really strange.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. My history teacher, I remember the first, because I did my leaving cert like in the pandemic. And my history teacher, oh, it was wild. But my history teacher, I remember, said to us, he was like, you know, we were doing Michael Collins and whatever. And he was like, you know, the teenagers that were at school during this time, like, couldn't have known that like 100 years later, you would all be studying this and writing essays on this. And he was like, and I'll guarantee you that in 100 years' time, they'll be writing essays and stuff about you. And that was just such a weird thought, to be like, I'm going to be, like, the year that the Leaving Cert was cancelled is going to be one of the years that, like, gets written about. Yeah. So strange, but so cool, kind of, in a way.
Yeah, it's that thing of like, you kind of always think, oh, it'd be kind of cool to live through history, and then you do.
And you're like, oh, I kind of liked it when things were boring. So my last question for you then, I suppose we've kind of already covered it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is your like number one piece of advice for maybe not even young writers, just like young people in general, but also young writers?
Okay, so I'm going to do two because I had to do, there was a messages to sixth class video thing that happened at the pandemic. It was organised by a writer and all-round book champion, Sarah Webb. Her new book, The Bee Charmer of Henrietta Street, has just come out, and I'm really excited to read it. But she kind of, yeah. But she wanted writers to record messages to sixth class and kind of talk to their, I suppose, on the cusp of teenage selves. And what I said is, my piece of advice is be your own best friend. Because in life, you're not always your own friend, and sometimes you're against yourself. And you can be harder on yourself than you are on other people. And, you know, kind of like, just try and look on yourself with the eyes of a friend, rather than to sit in judgment or to kind of punish yourself for things that you'd forgive others for. Do you know, if that makes sense? That's like my personal advice. But in terms of, if you want to be a writer, I suppose it's as simple as like write. And like write things you love. And like, particularly if you're a young writer, like, don't feel hampered by what is popular, by the market, because that will change like that. So if everyone's writing about spaceships and you want to write about Tudors, write your Tudor book, because that's the book of your heart. Do you know, don't write for, make it good enough for publication and tweak it and everything. But like, if you want to make it as a writer, and like, so much of it is luck, so much of it is timing, but to kind of write from the heart, if that doesn't sound way too corny, and to read a lot and within a wide variety of genres. I have no time for people who are snippy about genre fiction. No time for them, Libby. But, you know, like, because if you want, like, even if you want to look down on a genre of books or whatever, like, you know, like, do it from an educated perspective, and that is how you will learn what works in fiction, and what kind of writer you want to be, and what kind of writer you don't want to be, which is just as important. And that piece that I was saying earlier about building the sustainable writing practice and making time for it, because it matters, like, that's kind of key too. And don't make, you know, you don't have to make time for it like homework, and you don't have to make time for it with a word count. Just make time for it because it makes your heart happy and because you need it, you know?
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Thank you very much, Deirdre, for a wonderful interview.
And listen, you had the hard job, Libby. Thank you so much for your great questions.
Oh, no problem. And everyone should go and read Precious Catastrophes, or first they should read Perfectly Preventable Deaths, and then they should read Precious Catastrophe.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.